The general who turned a losing beach into a gateway to Europe in just 24 hours. 6:30 in the morning, 6th of June, 1944. Omaha Beach is already a graveyard. 45 minutes after H hour, the rising tide has crept over shattered bodies and twisted iron. Landing craft burn in the surf. Men cling to the shingle bank like shipwreck survivors clinging to driftwood. Every attempt to stand up is punished by a burst of machine gun fire from the bluffs 30 to 50 meters above them. At 7:30, another LCVP slams down onto the grey-green water of the English Channel, heading for the sector codenamed Dog White. The wooden hull shudders with every near miss. Salt spray lashes the faces of the men inside. Their steel helmets are slick with seawater and fear. In the middle of that cramped box of men stands Brigadier General Norman Dutch Cota, Assistant Division Commander of the 29th Infantry Division, 51 years old, lines of age and West Point discipline carved into his face. He grips the webbing strap overhead to keep his balance, boots slipping on the wet metal deck. He can't see the beach yet. All he can see is the pale blur of surf beyond the high bow ramp and the occasional fountain of water thrown up by incoming mortar rounds. Someone near him is whispering a prayer. Someone else is vomiting into the bilge water. The engine roars, then throttles back. The coxswain yells over the noise, but the words are swallowed by the wind and the steady mechanical cough of German MG-42 machine guns. The general is the oldest man in the boat, and the only one with a star on his helmet. But his body feels no different from the 20-year-olds around him, soaked, cold, and very aware of how mortal human flesh is under artillery fire. The ramp slams down. For the first few seconds, Cota sees almost nothing but smoke and sand and the blinding white of surf. Then the picture sharpens, a 5-mile crescent of beach rising in gentle slope, ending in a wall of shingle and a vague dark line of bluffs beyond. On those bluffs, invisible in the mist and smoke, dozens of German machine gun nests rake the shoreline with intersecting fields of fire. The first man out of the boat drops as if someone cut his strings. Cota steps into waist-deep water that feels like liquid ice. His boots dig into the sand and shingle. He stumbles forward, hunched, overloaded with gear. Rounds snap past his ears with a sound like enraged hornets. Behind him, another man falls face first into the water and doesn't move. The general does not stop to check who it is. He is not here to survive this beach. He is here to move it. By 0740, Cota has crawled to the low shingle bank that marks the high tide line. He belly slides into the thin safety of the stones, chest heaving, lungs burning from the sprint. The air smells of cordite, wet fabric, blood and burned diesel. Dozens of soldiers are already there, crammed behind the shingle and a short sea wall, pressed flat like they want to disappear into the earth. Many come from the 116th Regimental Combat Team of his own 29th Division. Others are from the 1st Infantry Division, washed sideways by currents and chaos. Their faces are grey, not from mud but from the understanding that this is not a training exercise. They look at the single star on Cota's helmet with a mixture of relief and expectation. A general is here. Surely he has a plan that doesn't end with them dying face down in the sand. Right now, he doesn't. Right now he sees what they see, the murderous geometry of Omaha Beach working perfectly against them. Why Omaha was failing. On maps in planning rooms in England, Omaha had been a neat annotated shoreline. 10 sectors with names like Dog Green, Dog White, Easy Red, Fox Green, arrows drawn from sea to land. Timetables showing waves of infantry, tanks, and engineers landing in disciplined sequence. In reality, navigation errors in the dark, strong currents, and smoke from the naval bombardment had scattered units all across the 5-mile front. Amphibious tanks, supposed to swim in ahead of the infantry and provide covering fire, had mostly sunk in the rough water. Engineers sent to blast gaps through the obstacles had been cut down before they could finish their work. Only a fraction of the scheduled 2,400 tons of supplies had reached the shore. Omaha was supposed to be the beach that connected the British landings at Gold to the American landings at Utah, closing the gap and creating a continuous Allied lodgment on the Normandy coast. Instead, by mid-morning, it was close to being written off as a blood-soaked failure. Offshore, on the command ship, Lieutenant General Omar Bradley was already asking whether Omaha could be evacuated and its troops diverted elsewhere. If that decision solidified, thousands of men on the sand would either die or surrender. The invasion's western flank would be left hanging in the air. On the German side, the plan was simple and brutal. Stop the invasion on the sand. There was no depth to their defense. Everything was concentrated on that narrow strip of land where water met earth. 4 lines of obstacles, Belgian gates, mine stakes pointing seaward, angled steel ramps intended to flip landing craft, and menacing Czech hedgehogs turned the intertidal zone into a maze designed to wreck boats and channel survivors into killing zones. Behind them, the minefields and wire began. Above all of it, the machine guns spoke. The MG-42, with its terrifying rate of fire, over 1,200 rounds minute, stapled every open patch of sand to the earth with lead. Mortars fell with a wet, hollow thump, flinging sand and shrapnel across helmets and faces. The defenders of the 352nd Infantry Division had the best seat in the house to watch an invasion die in slow motion. On Dog White sector, Kota understood all of this not as a historian, but as a man lying behind a shingle bank listening to bullets cutting the air inches above his spine. What he also understood, more than most, was how an amphibious assault ought to work. Before D-Day, he had served as a planner and advisor for amphibious operations, helping to design the very doctrines now failing around him. This was more than a tactical crisis. It was a personal one. If he stayed behind the shingle, the beach stayed a graveyard. If the beach stayed a graveyard, Europe remained a fortress. Something had to move, and the only things that could move now were the men around him, engineering the breakthrough. Kota's eyes scanned the terrain like an engineer dissecting a failed machine. Here was the basic problem. Horizontal movement along the beach was possible if you hugged the shingle and stayed flat. Vertical movement toward the bluffs was lethal across the open sand. The exits off the beach, the draws cut into the bluffs, were locked down by pre-sighted machine guns and mortars. The system was doing exactly what the Germans designed it to do: trap invaders in the tidal zone and kill them before they could reach firm ground. To change the outcome, Kota needed to break the system in at least 2 places. He had to create exploitable gaps in obstacles and wire, and he had to push small, aggressive groups through the weakest points in the line, not as rigid units, but as ad hoc assault teams. That meant engineers, that meant explosives, that meant movement under fire. He shoved himself up onto one knee, then onto his feet, exposing his upper body above the shingle. Bullets snapped past him. Sand spat into his face. He started yelling, not in the measured tone of a staff officer delivering a briefing, but in the full-throated voice of a man who knows that hesitation now is paid for in organs and bones. He moved down the line, kicking men, grabbing them by their webbing, pointing inland. He knew their instincts were telling them to stay flat. Every sensory input, from the roar of weapons to the impact of nearby rounds, was screaming, "Stay down." The human nervous system, clever as it is, does not naturally select run into machine gun fire as a preferred behavior. So he did what a good engineer does when a system is stuck in a stable but deadly equilibrium. He injected external energy. He picked one group and focused on them until they moved. He grabbed a lieutenant, pointed to a section of bluff where the fire seemed less intense, and ordered him to assemble whoever he could and push toward it. He found an engineer team crouched around a Bangalore torpedo, a long metal tube packed with explosives, designed to clear wire. He demanded to know why it wasn't already under the obstacles. The answer was obvious. The open ground between the shingle and the wire was under direct fire. Taking the torpedo forward meant standing up into that fire. He took the decision away from them. Get that thing up there. When it blows, you don't stay here. You go through. The Bangalores went forward. They were shoved under the wire by men whose hands shook so hard they could barely keep the tubes aligned. The fuses were lit. The men pressed their faces into the sand as the charges detonated with a sharp, concussive blast, throwing shredded wire into the air like metallic weeds. In those moments after an explosion, both attacker and defender are momentarily deaf. The air is white with smoke and dust. That's when movement matters most. Kota pushed men into those gaps at once, small groups, not waiting for a perfectly formed line. Fire and movement, leapfrogging from dune to shell hole, from shell hole to the base of the bluff. No one issued a perfectly formatted operations order. There was no coloured pencil overlay showing axis of advance. There was only a general who refused to let the assault die on the sand, and who understood that, under this kind of fire, decentralized initiative was not chaos, it was survival. Rangers, lead the way. He shoved himself up onto one knee, then onto his feet, exposing his upper body above the shingle. Bullets snapped past him. Sand spat into his face. He started yelling, not in the measured tone of a staff officer delivering a briefing, but in the full-throated voice of a man who knows that hesitation now is paid for in organs and bones. He moved down the line, kicking men, grabbing them by their webbing, pointing inland. He knew their instincts were telling them to stay flat. Every sensory input, from the roar of weapons to the impact of nearby rounds, was screaming, "Stay down." The human nervous system, clever as it is, does not naturally select run-into machine gun fire as a preferred behavior. So he did what a good engineer does when a system is stuck in a stable but deadly equilibrium. He injected external energy. He picked one group and focused on them until they moved. He grabbed a lieutenant, pointed to a section of bluff where the fire seemed less intense, and ordered him to assemble whoever he could and push toward it. He found an engineer team crouched around a Bangalore torpedo, a long metal tube packed with explosives, designed to clear wire. He demanded to know why it wasn't already under the obstacles. The answer was obvious. The open ground between the shingle and the wire was under direct fire. Taking the torpedo forward meant standing up into that fire. He took the decision away from them. Get that thing up there. When it blows, you don't stay here. You go through. The Bangalores went forward. They were shoved under the wire by men whose hands shook so hard they could barely keep the tubes aligned. The fuses were lit. The men pressed their faces into the sand as the charges detonated with a sharp, concussive blast, throwing shredded wire into the air like metallic weeds. In those moments after an explosion, both attacker and defender are momentarily deaf. The air is white with smoke and dust. That's when movement matters most. Kota pushed men into those gaps at once, small groups, not waiting for a perfectly formed line. Fire and movement, leapfrogging from dune to shell hole, from shell hole to the base of the bluff. No one issued a perfectly formatted operations order. There was no coloured pencil overlay showing axis of advance. There was only a general who refused to let the assault die on the sand, and who understood that, under this kind of fire, decentralized initiative was not chaos, it was survival. Rangers, lead the way. Somewhere along the dog-white sector, Kota encountered a cluster of men wearing different patches. The 5th Ranger Battalion. They had been swept off their intended landing point, just like everyone else, and were now pinned behind the seawall, no more immune to machine gun fire than any other soldier. He asked them what unit they were. 5th Rangers, someone shouted back. He looked at them, lean, hard men who had trained for the most dangerous missions of the war, and he understood that if anyone could claw a path off this killing ground, it was them. Then, if you're Rangers, lead the way. It was a simple sentence, 7 syllables in English. But in that moment it was a transfer of responsibility, a shot of voltage. They went. The Rangers pushed through a gap, climbed the bluffs under fire, and began to work their way inland, knocking out strong points from the rear. That phrase, Rangers, lead the way, would become the official motto of the U.S. Army Rangers. On that morning it was not a motto. It was a non-negotiable order. Around them other small groups did the same. They moved up narrow draws through ravines, around the stubborn concrete teeth of bunkers. They used satchel charges and hand grenades aimed at firing slits and ventilation shafts. They sniped at embrasures with rifles. Flamethrowers spat cones of burning fuel into positions that could not be approached frontally. Every bunker silenced, every machine gun nest cleared, widened the breach. Proof under fire, the beach turns. By midday, something subtle but crucial had happened to the pattern of fire on Omaha. Instead of the Germans firing outward in a clean semicircle onto the beach, they were forced to twist in their positions, turning to meet attackers coming from up the draws and along the cliff tops. Fields of fire that had once overlapped perfectly, now frayed at the edges. Some positions were overrun. Others were abandoned in haste as German squads realized they risked encirclement. From a systems point of view, the defense was losing coherence. From the beach, that looked like this. Places where previously any movement drew immediate fire suddenly became survivable. Not safe, never safe, but survivable. More troops came off the sand. More engineers cleared obstacles and mines. More units pushed through the embryonic exits off the beach. The tide, which that morning had been an ally to the German mines and obstacles, now rose high enough to cover some of the worst killing zones, shortening the open ground men had to cross. The total cost remained staggering. By the end of the day, American forces on Omaha would suffer around 2,400 casualties, killed, wounded, or missing. The 352nd Infantry Division would lose roughly 20% of its strength, about 1,200 men. But the beach itself, that strip of sand that had looked like a terminal failure in the first hours of daylight, was no longer just a killing zone. It was a loading ramp for men, for tanks, for artillery. By evening, nearly 34,000 troops had been landed on Omaha. They occupied a shallow, precarious foothold, still under artillery fire, still far from secure. But the nightmare scenario, a complete repulse of the assault, was gone. From the German point of view, the transformation was just as stark. In the morning, they had watched the sea deliver targets in neat waves. Their bunkers and casemates, carefully constructed over months, had worked as intended. By afternoon, reports filtered in of enemy infantry appearing inland, of positions along the ridge falling silent, of communications lines cut. For the defenders, this was the moment when a beach stopped being a front line and became a hinterland. Once that shift happens, the calculus changes. The question is no longer, can we prevent them from landing? It becomes, how long can we delay their push inland? By then, the answer was already written in the movement of men like Kota and the soldiers he had forced off the sand. The legacy of 24 hours. Within 24 hours of that first chaotic landing, Omaha was no longer a narrow, failing incision in Hitler's Atlantic Wall. It was a pulsing artery of the Allied campaign in Western Europe. Through it flowed men, tens of thousands of infantry from the 1st and 29th Divisions and follow-on units. Through it flowed steel, tanks, artillery pieces, trucks, engineers' equipment. Through it flowed supplies, ammunition, fuel, food, everything an advancing army consumes in enormous quantities. Omaha linked up with the British sectors to the east. It anchored the American sectors to the west. It ensured that the Normandy landings were not just a daring raid, but the beginning of a sustained offensive that would, months later, reach Paris, then the German border, and finally cross the Rhine. In history books, this is often presented as an inevitability, the smooth arrow of Allied victory drawn on a map. In reality, on that single beach, on that single day, the entire trajectory hung on a series of decisions made by individuals under extreme stress. Norman Kota was one of those individuals. He did not win Omaha Beach single-handedly. No one did. Thousands of men contributed with their own courage and terror, and frequently their lives. But Kota's refusal to let the assault freeze into paralysis, his insistence on getting men moving, his use of whatever units were at hand, National Guard infantry, regulars, rangers, engineers, was a decisive human factor in turning a failing beach into a functional gateway. In the months that followed, he would go on to command the 28th Infantry Division in brutal fighting in the Hürtgen Forest, bearing other burdens and facing other controversies. He was not a flawless hero. No general is. But on the morning of 6th of June 1944, on a stretch of sand codenamed Dog White, he was something essential. A man who would not allow a carefully planned invasion to die behind a shingle bank. He understood, with the cold clarity of an engineer and the weary experience of an old soldier, that the difference between a disaster and a gateway can be measured in meters of ground crossed under fire, and in the willingness of someone to stand up first. In the official language of after-action reports, Omaha Beach was secured and exits were opened, and objectives were eventually achieved. In the unofficial language of the men who lay in the sand that morning, the memory was much simpler. An older general walked down the beach, upright under fire, shouting at them to get up, and somehow impossibly they did.